Green Margaret. Well, if you were at the session this morning, and I'm sure most of you were, recognise the faces, you might have had the same reaction that I had, that the very interesting session was really about the past. People were talking about what don't we know, what do we need to know, when are we going to have this tribunal. And maybe if you could characterise the people on this platform now, we tend not to be that worried about the past. I mean, firstly, because you're never going to really find out what happened. If the Gardaí can't and the DPB can't, then you probably aren't going to in a tribunal. And it really doesn't matter to entrepreneurs anyway. I mean, typically, if you think back over anything that's happened to you that was a risky endeavour, if it succeeds, then you're going to rewrite history to position yourself as the great hero who saved the world and found the oil or whatever it is that you succeeded in. And if it fails, as most things do, you're probably going to brush much of it onto the carpet anyway. So really, there's not a lot of future in the past, and we shouldn't worry too much about it after 5 years. If you really want to humiliate the Anglo gentleman who amused us so much on the tapes, get a medieval stocks and put them in the stocks and throw something at them. But they're not going to get a fair trial. If you want to put them on trial, it's not that hard. You could try them for false accounting. It should have been done 5 years ago. But it's history now. Let's move on. Let's think about what we can do now. And our industry is a good example of the value of moving on, because if we focused on history, we wouldn't be doing anything at all, because 215 wells have been drilled in Ireland over 40 years and 158 in the offshore, and we've yet to produce any commercial oil. So that's about a spend of €3 billion or so, and most people would say, well, even by the standards of Anglo-Irish Bank, that's a lot of money. But I think that's a wrong approach, because many things that were done in the past are quite wrong. Like if you look at Irish exploration history, what actually happened was people first had successes relatively easily in the North Sea. And not unreasonably, the American companies and others said, well, you know, Ireland's beside the North Sea, so we're going to drill on the same sort of structure as worked in Scotland and Norway. And they drilled, and they didn't find any commercial oil and gas in those structures. But now we know so much more about how the world evolved geologically. Like when I was in school, which wasn't all that long ago, we didn't even know, it wasn't taught that the world was actually moving around on tectonic plates. We looked at the map of the world and we saw that Africa looked like it might fit into North America, but this was just a curiosity. We didn't realize that Africa actually was part of North America, and you may be surprised to hear that actually Donegal is also part of North America. And in fact, if you stand on the Black Pigs Dyke, which runs, of course, through the northwest part of Ireland, you can actually quite correctly, geologically, have one foot in Europe or Eurasia and the other foot in North America. And that's geology, and our understanding of geology has changed dramatically, even in the last 20 years. So what we are doing now with Ireland, particularly in the Atlantic, is that we are looking at old data with fresh eyes. And this wasn't really possible until quite recently, because 10 years ago, if you dealt with the Irish authorities, who are the people who license, they were mesmerised by the majors. A lot of people like to talk about the great Justin Keating and the staff he had, like Mr Holloway, and how they had high royalties and taxes, except for the inconvenient fact that their efforts were a complete failure. They didn't find anything that was commercial, apart from a small gas field off Kinsale. And what happened is, after the initial splurge of enthusiasm, really off the back of the North Sea, pretty well all the establishment companies left Ireland, and since then there's been an average of about one well a year, which is next to nothing. Compare that with tens of thousands in North America, dozens in Scotland or in Norway. What happened a couple of years ago, really, and full marks to the present minister, with maybe the insight of a former left-winger, he opened up 250,000 square kilometres, which is a lot. I mean, Ireland, you may not realise this, but Ireland is really a maritime country. So can I have a map? Maybe I'll edit it out of the... here we are. Just to give you a picture, the Irish territory is not what you may think it is. You may think that Ireland is this little island. But actually, Ireland is all that territory that is marked in a red line. And there's 13 times as much of it at sea as there is on land. So Ireland is actually a maritime country, and it's one of the most maritime countries in the world. And yet, anyone know what proportion of our GDP comes from the sea? It's just over 1%. I'm not saying it's easy to develop the maritime opportunity, but Ireland is a maritime country, and yet there's almost no exploration, and has been no exploration really for decades. And what the current minister did was, very practically, he said, well, guess what? We're going to open up a big chunk of the territory, basically a good chunk of that North Atlantic, about a 250,000 square kilometres, the biggest opening in one licence bid round that there had ever been, as far as we know. And pretty well everyone in the industry said, you're complete idiots. This is typical of the paddies. You're going to get no interest, there's no data, it's deep water, it's too difficult. If you get any bids, it'll be a small percentage close to the shore. And pretty well that was correct. There was only 6% bids. It was only the juniors, with one small exception, and it was on areas that had some data. But an interesting thing happened over the last 2 years. The juniors, who were undercapitalized companies that even Anglo-Irish Bank wouldn't lend to, they spent their million or two. We spent a couple of million. It may not seem a lot, but it's a lot if it's your own money. And we found that a lot of the reasons why we went into the license round actually were shot down. When we reprocessed the data, when we applied our new techniques, learning what we had learned elsewhere, we found that a lot of the models that we had actually didn't work, to be blunt. And when you're presenting to people, asking them to spend hundreds of millions, you can't get away with sleight of hand. You know, it's not like the property game. It has to be rigorous technically in business, which is not to say that it's certain, it's not certain, but it has to be rigorous. And we found a lot of those models were futile, were failures. But we also found some other interesting things, and particularly at depths that were much earlier rocks than what was key in the North Sea, which is the Jurassic. I won't bore you with the details. But basically, learning from the experiences offshore Africa, where another Irish company, Tullow, went into a play that had failed, looked at it with new eyes and new technology, drilled it out again, and brought in 2 billion barrels offshore Ghana. Looking in a very similar way, you may think Africa is very different, but actually the geology is quite similar in some ways, in that the Atlantic is spreading apart. And just looking at it, no one had ever thought that in those terms before. You won't get that from a Shell or a BP. They just don't think in those terms. The big companies have big balance sheets, but they're relatively uncreative, and they're afraid to take personal career risks. And just thinking laterally, we presented this to the department and said, this is our idea. And didn't go particularly well, the presentation. They thought it was a bit wacky. But we got... We were invited to bid for up to 3 packages. We got the first one we asked for, most of the second one we asked for, and they said, well, look, do you really want a third? And frankly, my board didn't. It was hard enough to persuade them to spend even $1 million without spending $3 million. But we found an interesting thing. We spent our money, and then we had the difficult job of trying to persuade a larger company, a sugar daddy, if you will, to come in. And you may think you're really good looking, but if the sugar daddy isn't prepared to write the checks, then it doesn't really matter how good looking you are. So the real test was when we went out to the discotheque and we started talking to some people. And we found an interesting thing. We found that there was quite a lot of interest in Ireland, notwithstanding the pretty unsatisfactory past. And that's interesting, and mostly partly it's the oil price, partly it's the favourable fiscal terms which Ireland does have. Mostly it's because the oil companies have been thrown out of so many places that by comparison Ireland doesn't look so bad. We have the rule of law, we're a working democracy, there are proper rules and regulations, and a not insignificant thing is that it's not a corrupt society. Now that might surprise many of you, but really, compared to a lot of places, it's not a corrupt society. I've never seen an example or heard of an example where a public servant or a politician tried to shake down an oil company. And that's not normal in the world, to put it diplomatically. So we found that there was a bit of an interest. Not that they were writing checks, but there was a bit of an interest. And as we were doing the walkabout and talking to the guys in Houston and Calgary and in London, we found that Partly they were prejudiced against us in the past. They said, oh, aren't you the person who used to have herpes? That was their view, because Ireland had failed in the past. And partly they were saying, well, I don't have any other date, and I have this big budget, and I've got vast amounts of cash flowing out of these huge profits from these very high oil prices. But we found an interesting thing. We found that the most interesting ideas were actually not coming from the super majors. That they weren't coming from the Shell or the Exxon. They will drill wells, they have budgets, but the most interesting and open-minded ideas were actually coming from the New World, Eamon's world, the Pacific Rim. And not just the Pacific, people slag off Americans, but there's quite an innovative American company called Cosmos, backed by private equity, that also charged into the Irish offshore and formed into two packages. But easily the most impressive company that we met in this endeavour was Woodside, which I'm sure none of you have ever heard of them. The biggest gas and oil company in Australia, exporting the main liquefied natural gas exporter to Japan and selling into the Japanese market at a very high price. And when we were talking to them and we were saying, well, the problem with these rocks is that they're likely to be gas prone, the Woodside lady, and it's nearly all a female team, again, different to Europe, she said, oh, that's really good, because that means if it's gas prone, that means the gas will be released from the reservoir rocks more readily. And we were scratching our heads and thinking, well, everyone knows that it's bad to find gas. Why is she excited by gas? And the reason is because the world has changed. And gas is no longer the orphan child, and gas can be very lucrative in a market like the European market. So new thinking, new attitudes. And very often here in Ireland, and even if you listen to the speeches this morning, people think of Ireland as their own county, or maybe the 26 counties. Or if you really want to go international, think of the United States or maybe the EU. But if you add up all the energy consumption in the world today, which is a good proxy for economic activity, more than half of it now is outside those places. Japan, Europe and North America is now less than half of the world's energy consumption, and rapidly falling as a percentage. So what that means is that the world that we have to engage with in the future will increasingly be not English-speaking, not European, not white-skinned. It's going to be the Indonesias, the Brazils, of course the Chinas and Indias, and the Australias. So we have to think in an innovative way about what might be done, and we have to get away from this negativity. Like some of you may have read about a week ago that ExxonMobil drilled a well in the southern part of the Porcupine, near where we are, and the industry view was that this was very unlikely to succeed for various reasons. One, there was no wells close by. Two, there was no three-dimensional seismic close by. But Exxon did what Exxon can do, spend what would have been up to $200 million or 150 million euro drilling a complete wildcat. 6 to 1 chance at best, maybe 10 to 1. You have far better chance in the discotheque here, I'm sure. And it was a non-commercial well, they walked away, and the market reacted quite negatively. We did not react negatively, and I'll tell you why, because their model was a bit of a flyer, but it's a technically strong conservative company, so they obviously had a model. They found what they were hoping to find, a reservoir rock. A lot of people, most people thought they wouldn't find a reservoir rock. Remember, there was no previous well in the area. More importantly, they found 144 feet, 44 meters of residual oil. Now, you may say, well, so what? It's not commercial. But the point is, if you have such a high column of oil, at one stage there was a large oil field there. Now, the bad news is that it was probably in the Cretaceous 100 million years ago. But still, there was a lot of oil there, and enough oil remains to prove, for the first time, that the southern Porcupine Basin actually produces oil. We didn't know that a week ago, and most people didn't think it. So even out of apparent setbacks can come hope and opportunities if you have the right mindset. But you're never going to have those opportunities, and you're never going to exploit those opportunities unless your mind is open to those opportunities. So what I'm talking to you about is natural resources, particularly oil and gas. But the same principle applies to any natural resource. And the most important natural resource that we have is actually our people. Why is it that we don't mind an apparel manufacturer like Fruit of the Loom used to be using our young people as workers at reasonable or even lowish rates. We don't think that's objectionable. Or an Apple coming in and maybe not even paying the 12.5% corporate tax. We don't seem to mind that. We don't object to that because we perceive it as something that we otherwise wouldn't have. But when it comes to a natural resource, like a mineral or a gas, people get all emotional about it and talk about our oil. It's our oil. We should have higher taxes. Well, it isn't our oil until we find it. And the state isn't going to find it. And Irish companies as juniors don't have the balance sheet to find it. No bank is going to lend you. It's risk capital. You have to deal with international companies. And the value of these projects can be very great. Basically, a medium-sized oil discovery off the Irish waters would be the equivalent of about 3 to 5 billion euro of value. Am I running out of time?
You are.
So think about it. That's about 100 hospitals. It's only a small portion of the Agro bailout, granted, but it's 2% of GDP. So what I'm suggesting to us is more openness to risk. The fact that property flippers got us into a mess doesn't mean that we shouldn't take risk today. And Sir Humphrey, with all his trying to avoid risk, will actually end up with a stagnant economy. I think we should be open to more risk, open-minded about new ideas, and not be afraid of the future. There's no future in the past. MacGill.